the first part of the verse says that traits that belong to your mind, these traits are superimposed on consciousness due to ignorance, due to lack of discernment. Now comes the metaphor. In the last line, you see the word yatha in the middle of the last line. Yatha, just like ambugate chandre chalanadi yatha ambasaha. Let me just explain. So suppose you have a pot outside at night, and the pot is full of water, and the water reflects the moonlight. So you can imagine looking into a pot filled with water and seeing the moon reflected in the pot. Suppose you jiggle the pot, you bump the pot, and you cause ripples in that water. When the water has ripples on it, and that ripply water reflects the moon, you look into the pot. Before you bump the pot, you saw a very nice moon. After you bump the pot and the water has ripples on it, now the moon has ripples. Moon doesn't have ripples. The reflection of the moon has ripples. It appears to have ripples. This is a metaphor. Look at the verse. He says, yatha, just like chalanadi, just like the chalana, the movement, ambasaha, of water, the movement of water, the ripples of water in the pot. What happens to those ripples of the water? They are, in the third line, kalpyante, those ripples are superimposed, are projected upon chandre, upon the moon which is ambugate, the moon which is reflected in the water. So let's put this together now. Just like when you get ripples in the water, the ripples that belong to the water, watch this very carefully, the ripples don't belong to the moon. Ripples belong to the water. But when you see the moon reflected in the ripply water, it looks like a ripply moon. The moon doesn't ripple, but it appears to. So the ripples that belong to the water are falsely superimposed on the moon. Moon represents consciousness. Ripples represent the activities of your mind. So look at what it represents. Let's see the whole metaphor. Just as the ripples in the water get falsely attributed to the moon, reflected in the water, in the same way, the ripples of your mind, thoughts, sensations, emotions. By the way, some of you know the word vṛtti is often used for a mental event. Anything that happens in your mind is called a vṛtti. Vṛtti can almost be considered a ripple in your mind. Those vṛttis, ripples in your mind, include thoughts, include sensations, and include emotions. So these mental ripples, vṛttis, they get superimposed on the consciousness reflected in your mind. That moon is reflected in the water. Consciousness is reflected in your mind. The moon is reflected in water that has ripples. Consciousness is reflected by your mind, which has mental ripples, vṛttis, thoughts, etc. Body represents the pot. Inside the pot, there is water. That water represents your sukshma sharira, subtle body in general, and your mind in particular. Now here he's taking the next step, and that is the mind that's inside your body is not a static thing. It's always moving. So the metaphor here is just as the water in the pot has ripples, in the same way the mind in your body has ripples, vṛttis. And the important point of this metaphor is just as the ripples that belong to the water are falsely attributed to the moon, in the same way, the mental ripples, vṛttis, that belong to your mind are falsely attributed to consciousness, which is reflected in your mind. Once again, I keep going back to that sadness because it's such a common experience and troublesome experience. Sadness is a ripple in your mind, but that particular ripple, sadness, gets falsely attributed to consciousness. Consciousness shines on your mind like the moon shines on the pot. When there are ripples in the pot of water, how does that affect the moon? The moon is utterly unaffected by the ripples in the pot. In the same way, consciousness, your consciousness, is utterly unaffected by the ripples in your mind, including sadness. This is discrimination. This is viveka. This is central to these teachings.